Long before the kingdom was built, there were beings older than memory itself, older than the first stone that was laid, older than the first light that was kindled in the dark, older even than the names that were given to things. They did not build cities, they did not raise banners or forge laws. They simply were, vast and quiet, drifting through an age that has no name in any language that still exists. An age before history began to record itself, before anyone thought to write anything down, or to chisel meaning into rock, or to pass stories from one generation to the next. They existed in the way that deep water exists, without purpose, without audience, without the need of either. And then, slowly, the way all things change when enough time has passed, the world around them began to shift. Small creatures emerged, civilizations stirred, kingdoms rose from the dirt, fragile and ambitious, and full of the particular kind of hope that only young things carry. And these ancient beings watched. Some of them descended, some of them reached out, some of them shaped what was growing around them, deliberately or otherwise, the way a river shapes a valley simply by continuing to flow. Some of them were worshipped, some of them were forgotten, some of them were both in that order, which is perhaps the loneliest fate of all. This is not a story about heroes or battles or the dramatic turning points that historians love to celebrate. This is something quieter than that. This is an attempt to understand what those ancient beings were, what they wanted, if they wanted anything at all, what they left behind in the stone and the silence and the dreaming dark, and what it means now that so many of them are gone. Settle into wherever you are. Let the world outside grow a little further away. There is no urgency here, only old things and the soft patience of the dark. To speak of higher beings is to speak of something that does not translate easily into ordinary language. The word higher is perhaps misleading if we take it to mean simply larger or more powerful or seated above others in some great hierarchy of importance. That is not quite what it means here. It is more subtle than that and more strange. A higher being in the world we are speaking of is something that exists on a different register of reality than the creatures that walk and burrow and build their small lives in the world around them. It is not merely that they are stronger, though often they are. It is not merely that they live longer, though that too is frequently true. It is something harder to articulate. Think of it this way. When you look at a flame, you understand that it burns. You understand in a practical sense what fire does and what it means. But the flame itself does not understand you. It does not think about you. It does not know that you are there, watching it, feeling its warmth. It simply burns because burning is what it is. A higher being is something like that, except reversed. A higher being is capable of an awareness that extends far beyond the ordinary, an awareness of things that smaller creatures cannot perceive, cannot touch, cannot even conceive of. They feel the world the way you feel a room you have lived in for many years. They know its dimensions without measuring them. They sense its temperature without thermometers. They understand its moods. But their awareness, vast as it is, does not always reach downward to the small things. The ordinary creatures of the world, scurrying through their brief lives, are sometimes invisible to them. Or visible, but in the way that dust motes are visible. Present, certainly, but not particularly meaningful. This creates an extraordinary imbalance. The smaller creatures can see the higher beings, or at least see their effects, their shadows, the places where reality bends slightly around them. They can feel them. They build their understanding of the world around them, or in opposition to them, or in worship of them. They become central to everything. They are gods, or close enough to gods that the distinction matters very little to those who are praying. And yet, the higher beings themselves may not fully register what is happening at the base of their existence. They may not understand what their presence means to those smaller lives. They may not know that entire civilizations have formed in their shadow, taken their nature as a kind of cosmic text to be interpreted, built temples to them, written their names in stone. This is not cruelty. It is not even indifference exactly. It is simply the difference in scale. And yet, sometimes a higher being does reach down. Sometimes they do look. Sometimes they do care, or something close to caring, in whatever way their vast and alien nature allows. And when that happens, when a being of that kind turns its attention to the small world beneath it, everything changes. In the place we are exploring, there were several such beings, each of them ancient, each of them strange, each of them carrying within their nature something that the world around them did not know how to contain. The pale king, who had been something else before he was a king. The Radiance, who had been worshipped and then forgotten, and who did not take that forgetting quietly. The Void, which was not a being in any conventional sense, but something older and more difficult than that. And others, quieter ones, beings who did not seek power or dominion, who simply existed in their particular way on the edges of the larger stories. We will come to all of them, but we begin at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as any of these stories have. We begin with something that moved through the dark, enormous and ancient, before it decided to become something else.
Before there was a pale king, there was a worm. Let that settle for a moment. The creature that would eventually become the ruler of Hallownest, the architect of its ambitions, the author of its laws, the god who dreamed of a kingdom that could outlast time itself, began its existence as something entirely different, something vast and slow and old in the way that geological formations are old. Not wise exactly, or not wise in any way that would translate into a throne room, simply present, simply enormous, simply ancient. Worms are not easy to describe because they belong to a category of being that does not have a neat definition. They are, in the most basic sense, creatures of great scale, long, serpentine, powerful in the way that forces of nature are powerful, not through the exercise of will, but through the simple fact of their existence. A worm moves through the world, and the world makes way for it. A worm occupies space, and that space is reorganized around its presence. But a worm is also something more than its physical dimensions. There is a quality to these creatures that goes beyond size, something in their nature that brushes against the edges of what we might call divinity. They are not gods, not quite, but they are not ordinary creatures either. They exist in that liminal space between the mundane and the transcendent, which is perhaps why, when one of them chose to become something more deliberate, something more shaped by intention, the transformation was so complete. When a worm dies, or when it completes some cycle that looks like dying but is something else, something more like a metamorphosis, what emerges is not the worm itself, but something new. Something that retains the depth and power of the worm, but adds to it a quality that the worm never had: consciousness, intent, will, the capacity to look at the world and decide what it should be. This is what happened in the deep time before the kingdom. A worm, ancient, enormous, drifting through whatever passed for the world in that earliest age, came to the end of its long cycle, and from that ending, something new emerged. A being pale as bone, a being small enough now to move among the smaller creatures of the world, a being who looked at what surrounded it, the scattered civilizations, the creatures fumbling towards something like order, the vast untapped potential of the dark caverns and glittering stones, and who felt, for perhaps the first time, something that might be called ambition. He would be called the Pale King. And he had, in that transition from worm to king, gained something extraordinary, something that the creatures of the world around him did not possess, or possessed only in fragments. He had gained what those who would come to know him called the higher mind, the capacity for a kind of thought that operated on a different level than ordinary cognition. He could perceive patterns that were invisible to others. He could understand the nature of things, the deep nature, not the surface, in a way that allowed him to work with that nature, to redirect it, to reshape it. He understood, for instance, what dreams were and where they came from. He understood in a way that no creature around him had previously grasped that consciousness and infection and soul were not separate categories, but aspects of a single interconnected reality. And he understood, and this is perhaps the most significant thing, that the world had a problem. There was something in the dreams of every living creature, something warm and golden and ancient that was slowly, quietly, inevitably reaching for them, pulling them home to a light that they had never known they remembered. He understood this because he was something capable of understanding it, and he decided to do something about it. This decision, this single act of will by a being who had chosen to be small enough to have will in the first place, set in motion everything that followed: the kingdom, the laws, the great experiment, the tragedy. But we will come to the tragedy later. For now, think about what this transformation means. A creature of pure, ancient, mindless power, a worm vast and slow and older than civilization, choosing in the moment of its ending to become something smaller and more focused and more intentional. There is something almost humble about that if you look at it from a certain angle. All that ancient power narrowed to a point, all that vast unthinking presence shaped into a mind that could sit at a table and think and plan and care about what happened next. He gave up enormity for purpose. He gave up the freedom of the worm's slow, unthinking drift for the much more complicated, much more painful, much more rewarding experience of actually wanting something. And what he wanted was a kingdom. Not a kingdom for its own sake, not out of vanity or a desire for dominion, or not primarily. He wanted a kingdom because a kingdom was a project, and the project he had in mind required one. He needed subjects and laws and structures and walls if he was going to build the thing he was building, which was a defense against the light that was reaching into the dreams of every living thing. He found a place, deep underground, where ancient stone had been slowly compressed by ages of pressure into something almost like architecture, where rivers of something luminous and strange wound through caverns as large as countries, where creatures already lived and traded and fumbled towards something like civilization. He came to them, and the way he came is important. He did not conquer. He did not arrive with force or with armies or with the kind of power that demands submission. He arrived with something more seductive than any of those things. He arrived with light. He lit the darkness of those deep places with a pale, cool radiance, not the warm, golden light that had been haunting dreams, but something different, something new, a light that did not demand or call or pull, a light that simply was, steady and calm and cold as moonlight on still water. and the creatures who lived in that darkness looked at it and looked at him and felt something that was new to them: safety, structure, the sense that someone was present who understood the shape of things and intended to keep them in order. He brought them soul, too, that luminous and mysterious substance that flows through the world like an underground river, that gives light and life and the capacity for something more than pure instinct. He found ways to gather it, to distribute it, to let it flow through the veins of the kingdom he was building. And the kingdom grew. Around the pale light of its strange god-king, Hallownest grew. Bugs, the small, diverse, endlessly varied creatures of this world, came to it from every direction, each with their own nature, their own culture, their own way of understanding things, and the Pale King made room for them all. He organized, he structured, he gave names to things and places and roles, and the names stuck, the way names do when someone says them with enough authority. He built a white palace, high above everything, where he and his queen, the White Lady, herself a higher being, a root and a vessel of something ancient, could exist in a kind of elevated stillness, separate from the ordinary world, but present in it, reachable, worshipped but not distant. He created laws, simple ones in the beginning. Do not stray beyond the borders. Do not touch the dreaming dark. Do not let the light into your mind. And beneath all the laws, beneath all the architecture and the distribution of soul and the organization of the kingdom's many districts and communities, there was the project, the great work that he had been building towards since the moment he emerged from the worm's ending with a mind capable of wanting something. He was trying to seal away a god that was already ancient when he was still a worm, a god that had been worshipped and then forgotten, and that had not, it turned out, accepted that forgetting gracefully. A god made of light and memory and dream. We will come to that god now.
She was there before he was. Let that sit for a moment in the quiet. The being known as the Radiance, when she is known at all, when her name has not been buried under layers of deliberate forgetting, was ancient in an entirely different way from the Pale King. She did not emerge from the ending of some great physical creature. She did not transform herself through the death of something enormous into something smaller and more intentional. She was simply always there, or as close to always as anything can be. She is a being of light. That is the first and most essential thing about her, and it is not a simple thing. The light that she embodies is not the pale, cool light of the Pale King's kingdom, not the steady, functional luminescence of soul. It is something warmer and older than that. Something that feels when you are near it, or when it is near you in the place where you dream, like a memory of something you cannot quite identify, like the echo of a warmth you once knew before everything got complicated. She was the first god of the creatures who lived in the dark places of the world. Before the Pale King came, before the kingdom was built, before any of the structures that would eventually define Hallownest existed, there were the moths. Small, pale, soft-winged creatures, drawn, as moths always are, to light. And the light that drew them was hers, her radiance, her warm glow reaching into the dreams of every moth and moth-kind creature, calling them toward her, making herself the center of their world. They worshipped her, not because they were compelled to, or not only because of that, but because she was genuinely magnificent. Because in a world of cold stone and deep dark, a being of that kind of warmth and brightness was everything. She was the sun they could not reach. She was the fire that did not burn. She was the dreaming light at the center of everything that mattered. And she spoke to them. Not always in words, Beings of her nature do not always need words. She spoke in the language of dreams, in the golden warmth that pooled in the sleeping mind, in the images and feelings and half-memories that drifted through consciousness at the edges of sleep. She was present in dreams the way that gravity is present everywhere, not visible exactly, but felt, constant, organizing, everything drifting toward her gently, inevitably. The moths built their understanding of the world around her. They formed rituals and remembrances and the particular kind of deep cultural architecture that arises when a civilization has a divine center that is both ever-present and never fully reachable. She was their god and their mystery and their home all at once. And then the Pale King came, and everything changed. He understood what she was, perhaps better than anyone else who had ever perceived her, better in some ways than she understood herself, in the way that someone standing outside a thing can sometimes see it more clearly than the thing itself can. He understood the mechanism of her presence in dreams. He understood that the connection she maintained with every creature whose mind touched the dreaming space was not merely spiritual, it was something more fundamental, something that was woven into the fabric of consciousness itself. And he understood that as long as she was present in the world, as long as she could reach into dreams, as long as her warmth could find its way into sleeping minds, there was no true safety for the creatures he was gathering into his kingdom. They would always be vulnerable to her pull, always susceptible to the light that remembered them even when they had forgotten it. He could not destroy her. That was not a thing within his power, or perhaps not a thing within anyone's power, because beings of her nature do not end the way ordinary creatures end. They persist. They linger, they return in one form or another, because what they are is too fundamental to simply stop being. But he could do something else. He could make them forget her. This is perhaps the most extraordinary act of the Pale King's long and extraordinary reign, and the most morally ambiguous. He went to the moths, the creatures who had worshipped the Radiance since before Hallownest existed, the creatures whose entire cultural identity was built around her, and he offered them something, not by force, not through conquest or law or the exercise of kingly power. He offered them a trade, the terms of which are not fully clear, but whose outcome is. The moths forgot. Generation by generation, carefully and completely, the memory of the Radiance was removed from them. Their stories changed. Their rituals became hollow forms whose original meaning had been quietly excised. The temples they had built to her remained, because how do you unbuild a temple without the question arising of why? But the reason for their existence faded from living memory. She was forgotten. And forgetting a god, a true god, a being of that age and that nature and that kind of fundamental presence in the dreaming world, is not a neutral act. She did not accept it. How could she? Imagine what it is to be a thing that exists in the awareness of others. A god does not merely reside in some separate realm, looking down on worshippers from a comfortable distance. A god of the kind the Radiance was, a god of dreams, of warm memory, of the reaching light in sleeping minds, is, in some deep sense, constituted by the awareness of those who hold her in mind. The worship is not incidental to what she is, it is part of it. When the moths forgot her, something happened.
The anger is too small for it, too human, too ordinary, too contained in the specific kind of frustration that arises when one person wrongs another person. What the Radiance felt, and feels she did, there is no doubt about that, was something larger, something closer to the reaction of the world itself when something fundamental is violated. A deep, slow, implacable disturbance. She did not disappear. She could not disappear. She waited. In the place where dreams gather, in the warm and luminous space that exists between one sleeping mind and another, she waited. Not patiently. Patience implies acceptance, and she had not accepted. But with the particular endurance of something that has existed long enough to understand that time is not an obstacle. Time is simply what happens while you wait. She reached out, in the only way still available to her, through dreams, through the thin and permeable membrane between sleeping consciousness and the dreaming space she inhabited. She found minds that could be touched, and she touched them, gently at first, then with more urgency, as the thing she was sealed inside of began to press more heavily on whatever passed for her awareness. Because the Pale King had not merely encouraged forgetting, he had taken more drastic steps. He had built a vessel. He had created, through a process that involved his own essence, his own higher nature, his own vast and painful deliberateness, an empty vessel, a being with no mind of its own, no self in the ordinary sense, no self that the Radiance could grip or infect or fill with her presence. Hollow in the most literal sense, a container defined entirely by its emptiness. And he had tried to use that vessel to contain her, to draw her in from the dreaming space, to seal her inside a thing that could hold her, that she could not escape, that could be hidden away in a place where she could trouble no sleeping mind. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. And the Radiance, sealed but not silent, waiting in the dark where she was not supposed to be able to wait, began to work her way back into the world through the cracks in the containment. She sent her light into dreams. She found the minds that were not fully sealed against her, and no mind, it turned out, was fully sealed, and she called to them, not in words, in the old language, the warm language, the one that spoke of belonging and wholeness and the comfort of a light that had been waiting for you, that had always been waiting for you. And some of them listened. And the thing that was meant to be a kingdom came, slowly and terribly, and with all the heartbreaking slowness of a great catastrophe, to its knees. But the Radiance herself, what is she, finally, when we try to see her clearly? She is not simply a villain in this story. She is not a being whose only quality is the desire to destroy what the Pale King built. She is something older and stranger and more comprehensible than that. She is a god who was abandoned, a being whose entire nature was oriented toward connection, toward the warm light of mutual recognition between a god and her worshippers, who had that connection deliberately severed, who the meaning of her existence was removed from her, not through natural forgetting, but through a deliberate act by a being who understood exactly what he was doing. She wanted, in some sense, only what any conscious being wants, to be remembered, to be known, to have her presence acknowledged by the minds that she had spent so long reaching toward. That wanting, constrained and suppressed and sealed in the dark, became something monstrous. It became infection. It became the golden haze that spread through the kingdom's dreams and made the dreaming creatures into something less than themselves. But at its origin, before the corruption and the sealing and the terrible pressure of containment, there was simply a god who had been forgotten. And the light of her wanting, even now, even in its most distorted form,
still carries something in it that was once genuinely beautiful. The warmth of being remembered, the warmth of belonging to something larger than yourself. It is difficult to look at what she became and see that original warmth, but it was there once. It is still there, maybe, under everything.
Below the radiance, below the pale king and his pale light, below the kingdom itself, below the deepest stone, below the place where roots grow and rivers run, and the most ancient geological formations have settled into something like permanence, there is the void. And the void is not a place exactly, though it has a location. It is not a being exactly, though it has something that functions like awareness. It is not a force exactly, though it exerts something that functions like pressure on the world above it. The void is something that does not translate. This is worth dwelling on for a moment in the quiet. Most of what we have been discussing, the pale king, the radiance, the worms, the dreams, these are things that can be approached through familiar categories: power, consciousness, memory, worship. They are strange, yes, they operate on scales and in registers that ordinary experience does not prepare us for, but they are, at some level, comprehensible. They have shapes, they have purposes, even if those purposes are vast and alien. They want things. The void does not want things. The void simply is. It is the oldest thing in this world, if age is a meaningful concept when applied to something that may have existed before the concept of time had anything to measure. It predates the higher beings. It predates the civilizations that grew up around them. It predates, in some sense, the distinction between light and dark, between presence and absence, between the full and the empty. It is the darkness before the first darkness was named. Physically, insofar as physical is a meaningful word here, it manifests as a liquid blackness, a dense, slow, utterly lightless substance that pools at the lowest reaches of the world, far beneath even the deepest inhabited places. It does not reflect light. It does not interact with light in any ordinary sense. When light falls on it, the light is simply ended, not absorbed, not reflected, simply concluded, the way a sentence ends when it reaches its final word. The creatures who know about it, and very few do, because there is no reason for most living things to journey to the place where the world ends and the void begins, do not agree on what it is. Some treat it as simply a physical feature of the world, a deep reservoir of some unknown substance, dangerous and lightless, and best avoid it. Others, those who have thought more carefully about the nature of the world and its higher beings, recognize that it is something more than that. It is, perhaps, the opposite number of the radiance. If she is warmth and light and the reaching quality of memory, if she is the God of things that are known and felt and held, then the void is the God of things that cannot be named, the God of absence, the God of the space between things, the silence between sounds, the dark between stars. But that framing may be too poetic. The void is not interested in being anyone's opposite. The void is not interested in anything. And yet, when the pale king was building his vessel, when he was creating that hollow, empty thing meant to contain the radiance, he looked toward the void, because the void is emptiness, and what he needed was a vessel defined by emptiness, a consciousness that could not be a consciousness, a soul space that was not a soul, a being whose interior was defined not by what it contained, but by what it utterly lacked.
He brought his children to the edge of the void, and the void accepted them. This is the strangest thing and worth thinking about carefully. The void, which has no purpose, no awareness, no qualities that we would recognize as those of a conscious being, accepted. The larvae that the pale king brought to it, the small and fragile and just beginning things that would be dipped in the void and filled with its absence, did not simply fall into it and vanish. They were received. The void took them in and gave them itself, its darkness, its emptiness, its fundamental quality of being the thing that cannot be named and therefore cannot be claimed. They became, in that immersion, vessels of the void. And the void, in becoming part of them, gained something it had not previously possessed. Not consciousness, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, a point of view, a way of existing in the world that was not merely the passive endurance of absence, but something more dynamic. Through the vessels, the void could act. This is the extraordinary thing, a force that had existed for longer than anything in the world, that had simply pooled at the bottom of everything, silent and lightless and without intention, found in these strange children of a stranger king a way to be in the world above it. And what it did with that presence, what the void does when it acts through the beings that carry it, is profoundly strange. It unmakes. Not violently, not with the dramatic destruction of something being broken or burned. The void unnames things. The void removes the quality of presence from things. The void, where it pools and moves and reaches, makes things less defined, less insistent on their own existence. Against the radiance's light, against that warm, urgent, reaching brightness, the void is the only thing that does not simply yield. The light meets the void, and the void does not fight it, does not resist it, does not interact with it in any of the ways that one force normally interacts with another. The void simply absorbs it, takes it in, ends it, the way it ends everything, in the quiet way that something ends when it reaches the edge of the world and there is nothing beyond the edge to continue into. There is something almost merciful about the void if you approach it from a certain angle. It is the peace of the truly empty, the rest of the thing that has finally set down every quality it was carrying and agreed to simply be nothing for a while. Every living creature carries within it, at some very deep level, a fear of that emptiness, the animal instinct for survival, the clinging to form and light and the warmth of being alive, is precisely a rejection of the void at the center of things. And yet, there is something in the idea of it that is also restful. The void does not suffer. The void does not mourn. The void does not lie awake in the dark, turning things over, looking for the point where something went wrong. The void simply is what it is, completely and without apology. And that completeness, even in emptiness, perhaps especially in emptiness, has a quality to it that is not nothing. It is the deepest rest, the rest beneath rest, the quiet beneath quiet. The void is still there at the bottom of things, patient in the way that only something without awareness can be patient, waiting for nothing, because waiting implies expectation, and the void does not expect. It simply remains, as it has always remained, as it will continue to remain, long before the last memory of the kingdom above it has faded from every living mind.
The great beings, the pale king, the radiance, the void, take up so much of the story that it is easy to forget the others. but there were others. The world does not have room for only a handful of ancient things. It is a large world, and its deep places are many, and the processes that give rise to beings of unusual nature and unusual power are not so selective as to produce only the most dramatic examples. There are quieter ones, beings who did not wage wars of light and dark, beings who did not build kingdoms or reach into dreams, beings who found their own ways of existing in the ancient world and who remained in those ways, steady and particular, while the grander drama played out above and around them. Is one of these. She is, in some sense, the easiest to love of all the higher beings, though love is perhaps a strange word to use for something so profoundly non-human. She is the least dramatic, the least interested in power or influence or the shaping of history, and perhaps because of that, she is also, in a certain way, the most genuinely at peace. Is a being of nature, of growth, of the slow, persistent, largely unconscious will of living things to continue living, to extend themselves into new spaces, to reach toward whatever nourishment is available, and become whatever form allows them to do it most effectively. She is, in the most literal sense, rooted. She does not move, or if she moves the way that plants move, which is to say, she moves in ways that are real and significant, but too slow to be visible as movement. She grows, she expends, she allows herself to be shaped by the pressures of the environment around her, and in doing so, shapes that environment in return. She is ancient in the same way that a great tree is ancient, not through drama or transformation or the kind of power that announces itself, but through sheer persistence, through the accumulation of time, through the quiet and absolute commitment to continuing no matter what changes around her. The creatures that know of her speak of her with a particular kind of reverence, not the reverence that arises from power, not the reverence that says, here is something that could destroy me, and so I honor it out of a mixture of awe and self-preservation. The reverence they feel for is quieter than that, more personal. Because unlike some of the other higher beings, is genuinely present to those who seek her. She can be found. She lies in a specific place, in a particular grove of water and root, and she can be reached by those who are willing to move slowly enough to find her. And when she is found, she is not distant. She is not sealed behind the glass of her own immensity. She is simply there, enormous and still and warm in the way that living things are warm, breathing in the slow rhythm of something that has been breathing for a very, very long time. She knows about the Pale King. She knows about the Radiance. She knows about the great drama that has played out in the kingdom above her quiet place. She knows in the way that a very old being with deep roots in the world knows things, not through the deliberate gathering of information, but through the connections that run through everything, the subtle channels of water and growth and living matter that link all things to all other things if you only know how to listen. And she has chosen, with full awareness, not to involve herself. This is not cowardice, and it is not indifference in the cold sense. It is something else. The decision of a being whose nature is oriented toward life and growth and the long view, that the kind of intervention required would not, in the end, serve anything she cares about. She cares about the living world. She cares about the persistent, stubborn, beautiful tendency of living things to continue, and she has calculated, if a being like her can be said to calculate, that her continued existence in her particular form serves that care more reliably than any dramatic gesture would. She remains, she grows, she tends in her wordless way to whatever she can tend,
And in a world full of catastrophic intervention and the consequences of grand ambitions, there is something quietly radical about that choice. Beyond Un, there are others for harder to see clearly, whose nature is even more difficult to articulate. There is the White Lady. She is the Pale King's queen and a higher being in her own right, not merely the consort of one, but something ancient and essential in herself. She is described by those who know of her as a root, not metaphorically, but literally. She has taken root in the deep places of the kingdom and exists in a form that is half being and half location. She and the place she inhabits have become the same thing over time. The boundary between her body and the earth has blurred. She is made of something that the Pale King was not. Where he was pale light and cold clarity and the determined exercise of a higher mind toward specific goals, she is warmth and growth and the particular kind of wisdom that comes from having been still for a long time and allowed the world to flow through you. She gave something to the project of the vessel, something of herself, her nature, her essence, combined with the Pale King's to create the particular quality of the children that were then brought to the void. She is part of what they are. And she carries in her rooted stillness the grief of what happened to them, the grief of the mother who understood what was being sacrificed and sacrificed it anyway, because the alternative was the loss of everything. That grief is part of her, like her roots are part of her. It has grown into her form over the long years since the kingdom ended. It is not a thing she holds, it is a thing she has become. There are other presences in the deep world, things less clearly defined than Un or the White Lady, things that might be called higher beings or might be called simply old, depending on your definition. The ancient ones, the deep ones, the things that exist at the edges of the map and the edges of understanding. They do not need names in this telling. They are what they are, old and present, and part of the fabric of a world that is older than any of the kingdoms built upon it. They remind us that the story is never only about the beings who chose to act dramatically. The world is full of things that simply persist, things that have been here long enough to carry something important, even if what they carry cannot be easily named.
For a time, and it was a long time by any measure that matters, it held. The kingdom that the Pale King built was remarkable, not perfect. No kingdom is perfect, and this one less than most, given what it was built on top of and what it required to exist. But remarkable. A civilization of genuine complexity and beauty and variety, carved from the dark stone of the underground world and lit by the pale glow of its king's particular light. The various districts and communities of Hallownest each had their own character. Each community of insects that had gathered around the kingdom's center had retained something of their original nature, their original culture, while also being woven into the larger fabric of the kingdom's life. There was trade and art and something that functioned like scholarship. There were those who studied the nature of the world around them, the properties of soul, the behavior of creatures, the architecture of the deep places, with genuine curiosity and genuine rigor. There were theaters and temples and markets and homes. There were beings who lived out their entire lives within the kingdom's boundaries and found in those lives something meaningful and even joyful. The Pale King presided over it all from his high palace, and he was worshipped with the particular kind of worship that arises not from fear alone, but from genuine gratitude. He had brought light. He had brought soul. He had brought the structures that allowed life to be something more than mere survival. The creatures of Hallownest knew this, and they honored him for it. And the Radiance was sealed. Or as sealed as anything that cannot truly be destroyed can be sealed. The dream, or whatever the Pale King's great project had created, held. The kingdom breathed and grew and continued. But the balance was always more fragile than it appeared. The Pale King knew this. That is perhaps the most significant thing about him. He was not naive about the situation. He understood with full clarity that he had not solved the problem, he had only delayed it, and the delay was maintained at enormous cost. The cost of the vessel, the cost of the children brought to the void, the cost of the deliberate engineering of emptiness into something that had once been, that should have been alive. He knew what he was asking, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was worse. But the balance required maintenance. It required that the vessel remain intact. It required that the emptiness stay empty, that the hollow at the center of the Great Seal remain truly and completely without self. And that was the impossible demand. The demand that something live but not be alive, that something exist but have no existence worth the name. The seals that the kingdom maintained, the monuments and the rituals and the physical architectures of containment, were part of the mechanism. Dreamers, beings who had been put to a particular kind of endless sleep, maintained the outer seal through their dreaming presence. Creatures called king's molds guarded the inner places. The kingdom itself, in its continued existence and its continued worship of its Pale King, was part of the mechanism. And the void. The void was the wild element, the thing that did not fit neatly into the Pale King's system, because the void does not fit neatly into anything. When he brought his children to it, those fragile larvae, those intended vessels, he gained allies of extraordinary power. Beings who carried the void within them were immune to the radiance in a way that nothing else was. The light that reached into every sleeping mind, that slid through every crack in every seal, found no purchase in a mind that was not truly a mind, found no warmth to kindle in a being whose interior was the lightless space where warmth cannot exist. But the void had its own nature, its own trajectory, and the balance between the Pale King's pale light and the ancient darkness he had drawn upon was not a stable equilibrium. It was a tension, a managed opposition, and like all such tensions, it required constant attention, constant maintenance, constant willingness to pay the cost. When the cost became too great, when the vessel failed, when the seal was broken, when the Radiance finally found the crack she had been seeking, the balance collapsed. And it collapsed the way that great things collapse. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the slow and terrible way of a structure that has been compromised at its foundation. First the edges, then the middle, then the center. The infection spread through the dreaming minds of the kingdom. The golden light that the Radiance had been forced to compress into so small a space began finally to breathe again, and it breathed into everything, into the warriors and the scholars and the traders and the insects going about their ordinary days, into the minds of the infected, those who had been most fully reached by the light, and in their reaching had lost the particular individual quality of their consciousness, their selfhood, if you will, and been drawn into something larger and warmer and more insistent than themselves. The Pale King, watching the collapse of the thing he had built and the failure of the thing he had sacrificed so much to create, was faced with an impossibility. He had done everything right. He had made every calculation correctly. He had paid every cost, asked others to pay costs they had not agreed to, built a system of extraordinary complexity and care, and it was failing anyway. What he did next, if he did anything, is difficult to know. The records that remain are fragmentary.
The story that comes down through the ruins of the kingdom is incomplete, filled with gaps that can be filled only with inference. But the White Palace, his high retreat, went silent, and the kingdom, stripped of its center, stripped of the pale light that had organized it and the pale mind that had maintained it, fell into the long darkness that follows the ending of things.
Now we arrive at the place where history becomes something else, something more personal, more philosophical, the place where we stop cataloging what happened and begin asking what it means. These beings, the pale king who chose to be small, the radiance who could not forget, the void that simply was, are not just characters in an old story. They are, in some sense, illustrations of something, working examples of certain ideas about power and consciousness and what it costs to care about the future. Consider what the Pale King did. He was the most powerful individual in the history of the kingdom he created. He was, in the most literal sense, a god, a being of higher nature, capable of perception and understanding and action that no ordinary creature could match. And he used that power in the service of a project, a long, costly, difficult project whose implementation required him to make choices that no being should have to make. He chose to give up the worm's vastness for the narrowness of intention. He chose to engage with the world rather than simply exist in it. He chose over and over the more difficult path, the one that required thought and planning and the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to watch something fail and try to fix it and fail again. And at the end, it was not enough. What does that mean? It might mean that power, however great, is not equal to every problem, that there are challenges that exceed the capacity of even the most capable being, that the universe does not, in the end, reward effort with proportional outcomes. Or it might mean something more specific, that the particular solution he chose, the suppression of one ancient power using another, the deliberate creation of emptiness, the forgetting forced upon those who had something worth remembering, was flawed at its core. Not because his intentions were bad, but because the method was. You cannot solve the problem of light by burying it. You cannot solve the problem of a god's desire to be remembered by making everyone forget. The thing that was suppressed does not cease to exist when it is suppressed. It waits. It accumulates pressure. It finds, eventually, the crack that allows it to breathe again. And when it does, it is no longer the thing it was before it was suppressed. It has been changed by the containment. It has become more urgent, more all-consuming, more unable to tolerate the boundaries that were placed around it. The Radiance who reaches into dreams at the story's end is not the same as the Radiance who was present in the moth's worship at the story's beginning. She is what happens when something that needs to be free is not freed, when something that needs to be recognized is not recognized, when the answer to presence is suppression rather than acknowledgement. There is a lesson there if we are willing to draw it out slowly and without insistence. And the void. The void suggests something else, something about the nature of emptiness, about what happens when you look for the thing that cannot be claimed or corrupted or reached by the brightest light, and you find that it exists. There is something in the void that is not merely negative, not merely the absence of qualities, though it is certainly that. There is something in its nature that is complete in a way that the more defined things are not. The Pale King is all intention and light and the weight of his own purpose. The Radiance is all warmth and memory and the reaching quality of things that need to be known.
Both of them are defined by what they are, and that definition is also a limitation. The void is defined by what it is not, which means, paradoxically, that it is not limited in the same way. It cannot be infected by the radiance's light because it has no interior for the light to fill. It cannot be sealed by the Pale King's mechanisms because it is already the seal, already the silence at the bottom of everything. There is a kind of freedom in having nothing to protect, and there is something worth sitting with in that. The moths who forgot the radiance. This may be the element of the story that lingers longest if you let it. A civilization that had something, a god, a center, a warm presence at the heart of their culture, and had it removed, not because they chose to let it go, not because they had outgrown it or decided it was no longer useful or true, but because something more powerful decided that their connection to their god was a liability and removed it without their consent. And they continued. The moths continued. Their culture persisted, changed, hollowed of its original meaning, but still present. Their temples still stood. Their rituals still happened. The forms remained as the content faded. This is the saddest thing about the forgetting. Not that the radiance was hurt by it, though she was, and her response to that hurt was terrible. The saddest thing is what happened to the moths, the civilizations that continue to perform the forms of their meaning after the meaning itself has been removed, the gestures of worship after the god has been carefully erased.
They kept the shape of their devotion. They lost the substance, and no one told them. How many civilizations have done this? How many times has a culture maintained its rituals past the point where anyone can remember what the rituals are for? Not because they are foolish or forgetful in any culpable sense, but because something was taken from them, and the taking was done gently enough that they do not notice the loss. Memory is the thing that makes us who we are, individually and collectively. The memories we hold, the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from and what we value and what we are here to do, these are not decorations on top of an identity that exists independently. They are the identity. And when memory is removed, however good the reason, however urgent the necessity, something irreversible happens to the thing that remembered. The Pale King understood this. He did it anyway. That is the most tragic thing about him. Not that he failed, not that the kingdom fell, but that he understood exactly what he was destroying and destroyed it because he had decided that the survival of the whole was more important than the integrity of the parts. He may have been right. He may have been wrong. He was certainly doing the best he could with the tools he had, facing a problem that may not have had a good solution. And that is perhaps the most human thing about him, despite being as far from human as it is possible to be. He tried. He failed. He was a god, and he tried, and he failed, and it mattered. We come now to the end of this long telling. The world grows quieter here at the edge of things. The details fall away. The specific names and places and events lose their sharpness and become something more like texture, the texture of an old story worn smooth by the years. The kingdom is silent now. Whatever struggle has played out in its depths, whatever clash of ancient powers has finally reached its resolution, the stone is still. The pale light is diminished. The warm golden radiance has either faded or been fully extinguished. The dreamers who maintained the outer seal have been released from their dreaming. And the void remains. It always remains.
Beneath the stone and the silence and the memory of a kingdom that was built on impossible hopes, the void continues to pool in the lowest place, patient with the patience of something that has never needed to be anything other than what it is, dark with the darkness that precedes all other darkness. There is something both sad and restful about a ruined kingdom. We tend to focus on the loss, on what was built and then unmade, on the lives that were lived and ended, on the ambitions that reached so high and fell so far. And that loss is real. It deserves to be acknowledged. The creatures of Hallownest, the ordinary ones, the ones who simply wanted to live their lives in the pale light of the kingdom, who had nothing to do with the grand ambitions of gods, they suffered the consequences of choices they had never been asked to ratify. They deserve to be mourned. But there is also something else in the ruins, something that is worth noticing. The stone is still there. The carved walls and the ancient structures and the deep bones of the place, they remain. Changed, certainly, overgrown in some places, collapsed in others, but present. The world does not become nothing when the kingdom that named it falls. The roots are still there. Un is still there, in her quiet grove, breathing her slow breath, tending to whatever she can tend. The void is still there, at the bottom of everything, dark and patient and complete. And in the ruins of the kingdom, if you moved through them slowly and with the right kind of attention, you would find still the traces of what was built, the art, the architecture, the evidence of a civilization that had, whatever its flaws and its tragic compromises, contained genuine beauty, genuine care, genuine attempts by small creatures to make their lives meaningful in the shadow of things larger and more ancient than they could fully comprehend. This is what remains when kingdoms fall. Not the grand purposes of their founders, not the ambitions of their gods, not the resolution of the great conflicts that defined their rise and decline. What remains is the texture of ordinary life, the evidence that small creatures lived here and worked here and cared about things and made beautiful objects and had rituals that meant something to them and loved, in whatever way they were capable of loving, the world they inhabited. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The higher beings, the ancient ones, the vast and strange and difficult ones, shaped the world that these ordinary creatures inhabited. They set the parameters. They defined what was possible and what was not. They made choices whose consequences rippled outward through centuries and altered the lives of every creature in their reach. But they did not make those lives. The lives were made by the creatures who lived them. And somewhere in the ruins of the kingdom, in the stone that remembers without knowing what it remembers, in the carved patterns that have outlasted the hands that carved them and the minds that conceived them, there is something still present, not quite memory, not quite a ghost, something more like an echo. The echo of a civilization that tried, that reached for something, order, meaning, safety, beauty, the dream of a future that would outlast the present, with the tools available to it in the world it was given, under the influence of gods both wise and terrible and neither, and fell short, and left behind in the falling this, the stone, the silence, the echo.
Think of the Pale King in this last quiet moment, not as a king or a god or the architect of a catastrophe, simply as a being who emerged from something vast and ancient and chose to become small enough to want something, who looked at the world around him and felt, for the first time, the particular ache of caring about what happened next. He gave up enormity for purpose, and purpose, it turns out, does not protect you from failure. But he chose it anyway. He chose the weight of caring, the difficulty of intention.
The terrible vulnerability of having a project that could fail, a kingdom that could fall, children that could be lost. He chose all of it. And there is something worth honoring in that choice, even at this distance, even in the ruins it left behind. The Radiance, too, in this last quiet moment, not as the infection or the enemy or the warm and terrible light that reached into sleeping minds and removed from them the individual quality of their selfhood, simply as a being who wanted to be known, who had offered warmth to those who needed it in an age before warmth was easy to find, who had been the center of something beautiful and had had that something taken from her, and who in her loss became something very far from what she had been. She wanted to be remembered. That is a desire so familiar, so fundamental, so deeply woven into the nature of any conscious being that it is almost impossible to condemn it, even in its most distorted form, even in the catastrophe that resulted. She wanted to be remembered, and we remember her, imperfectly, in the ruin of the thing she did to the kingdom that forgot her, but we remember her. Perhaps that is something. And the void. There is no way to end with the void, because the void does not end. It was there before the story began. It will be there after the story is over. It pools at the bottom of everything, patient and dark and complete. And it asks nothing and offers nothing, and simply is what it is, which is the ancient silence beneath all things, the silence that existed before the first name was spoken, the silence that will exist after the last name is forgotten. There is no grief in it. There is no warmth in it. There is only the void, and the long dark, and the particular peace of the truly empty. Rest now. The kingdom is quiet. The ancient beings are at rest, or what rest means for things that cannot fully rest. The pale king is gone from his high palace. The radiance has stilled. The void remains, as it always has, as it always will. The stone is old. The silence is older. And beneath the silence, beneath the stone, beneath the memory of everything that was built and dreamed and sacrificed and lost, the deep dark breathes, slowly, steadily, without urgency, without agenda, simply the breath of a world that continues, even when the kingdoms built upon it have fallen, even when the gods who shaped it have faded, even when the stories that gave it meaning have dissolved into the long, untroubled dark. The world continues. The stone remembers. And somewhere in the deep places where ancient roots still grow and ancient water still runs, there is a quiet that is not absence, a quiet that is presence, the presence of all the old things, resting in the only way they know how. Still, patient, older than memory, older than any name we could give them. Still here, still here.